Hey folks, my name is Ted. It's been a couple weeks. Actually, it's probably been maybe 5 weeks, but I'm back on tour with the Business of Cyber, talking about limited resources inside the industrial cybersecurity space. There's not enough resources out there in the form of people, time, and budget. And we bring folks on to the show to talk about things that are happening to security leaders, things that are happening within our industrial security space. And I'm really excited to have somebody who's coming from a legal background, who has been out there really understanding what it's like to be a CISO, really what it's like to defend different security leadership in the cybersecurity space, in the AI space. And I'm really excited to talk about the legal landscape, the regulatory landscape. And to help me do that, Jessica Nall is going to be joining. Let me bring her onto the stage. Jessica, it's a real pleasure to see you today. How are you?
I'm doing great, Ted. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, well, we've had a couple conversations, I think almost like 3 months ago. I think someone had introduced us together. We were just having a casual conversation probably before or right after you had spoken this year at Black Hat. And I was captivated by your perspective and what you do for the industry. So I appreciate you taking the time to be on the show today.
I'm honored to be here. I'm excited to get started and help spread the word about what CISO should be thinking about in this area.
Very cool, very cool. So our format today, we're going to be going over 7 or 8 different topics, all of them narrowly focused into what is it like to be a CISO on the security battlefield today, regardless of your sector type. And to help us do that, looks like we're going to be talking about regulatory landscape. We're going to actually have a real case study that you're going to walk us through, learn from some other cases, and then I think if you'll agree with me, our intent here is that whether you're a CISO, whether you're an automation engineer, whether you are not in security, you have a better understanding about what the world around cybersecurity is starting to do to affect businesses and how they think about risk, and primarily how do leadership really start navigating that. Anything to add?
No, I think you've got it perfectly right.
Very cool. Well, to help us kind of understand where you're coming from and kind of what your background is, tell us what you do on a regular basis and what your passions are.
Sure thing. So my passion for my entire legal career has been opposing the federal government in their efforts to use hindsight enforcement against individuals and pick apart everything that people have done in the heat of the moment. And that has taken the form of representing quite a few CISOs and other cybersecurity professionals in SEC and DOJ enforcement actions, and then more lately, a lot of AI enforcement. But a good day for me is a day when I'm going toe-to-toe against the massive power of our friends in the government on behalf of people and companies.
Understood. Well, to help us kind of navigate the waters here, I think setting the foundation, I think that I work primarily in the industrial spaces. And right now there's just this huge question mark. It happens at the board level. It happens at the facility level. And the question mark is, how much emphasis are we going to put in cybersecurity? How much budget are we going to put there? Who's the right person to lead that charge? Should it be an IT function or should it be an OT function? But when you think about the reasoning behind it, a lot of folks would tell you we want to manage our non-productive time, we want to manage our brand. But the truth is I think a lot of the industrial spaces have watched the finance space, they've watched the retail space, they've watched the banking space, they've watched a lot of these critical companies get hit with a big cyber attack. And then watching the fallout, I'd have to say a lot of industrial companies are asking themselves, what are we going to do next? And so I think you see that whether it's in Europe with the NIS2 directive, whether you see it here with the SEC. Tell us about the shifting regulatory landscape and help us understand, is that really the driving force behind a lot of these new CISO concerns about cyber risk? Or is it a mixed bag depending on the company?
It is a little bit of a mixed bag, Ted. The biggest change in the regulatory landscape was at the end of last year. The SEC passed a whole raft of new disclosure regulations requiring, I think most people are familiar with the 4-day time clock to disclose material cyber incidents. And then there are also rules requiring detailed disclosures around cyber risk and incidents, and essentially really upping the ante on what the government is demanding of public companies, issuers, in making these disclosures. And then everybody who wants to be public at some point sort of has to follow the same standards and think about these things. And so what it is requiring is all of the sort of things that would have been handled internally and kept within the company about, oh my goodness, we're dealing with a major attack and we suspect it's this party or that party, and here are the downstream impacts on that those things now have to be made public, and they have to be made public quickly, and they have to be done to a level of detail that has never before been required. And we just saw the very first settlements coming out of the 2023 SEC regulations around cyber just last week, October 22nd, where 4 companies settled for having allegedly violated these regulations by not providing enough detail about the downstream impacts on them from the SolarWinds attack. So we are seeing enforcement in this area, and it's going to continue regardless of what happens in the election. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of government focus on this area because they've not been able to come up with any other solution for the ongoing and intensifying landscape out there of cyber threats.
Now, this is all public knowledge, right? Can you share a little bit about, I think it was Checkpoint, Mimecast, Avaya, that's public knowledge. Is it also, but I didn't know, I mean, how much are we talking here in some of these penalties?
They're not huge. I mean, these are not gigantic companies necessarily. Obviously, they're very
Looks like about $1 million a piece.
very reputable. So, yeah,
one was $1 million,
990,
95.
Exactly. It's a hit. It's a hit to the budget. It's an expense, and it's the expense of the brand reputation damage that you get from this, publicity around a settlement with the SEC, admitting wrongdoing essentially in a landscape where it's all kind of hindsight. It's driven by looking backwards on, from the government's perspective. And again, once again, as usual, picking apart decisions made in the heat of the moment, and pretty large fines, I think, altogether.
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear. It says, but each negligently minimized its cybersecurity incident in its public disclosure. So in layman's terms, these are 4 examples of people who didn't put as much detail as required, and now they're being fined, in some cases $1 million, and somebody had to pay $4 million.
That is correct, but it's not clear from the regulation itself what level of detail is actually required. Sure. And there's also, as you know, from being, such a leader in the cybersecurity industry, that the level of detail that you want to tell the public, to tell essentially the threat actors about your systems and your risks and your attacks, it's got to be balanced. And I think the government wants a lot of detail. And I think those of us who are trying to protect, the company's infrastructure want less detail. So it's a push and pull.
It makes sense. Now, just out of curiosity, where does that money go? I mean, does it go to fund do we know that?
Yeah, it does. It goes back to the SEC. So sometimes there are victim funds, but not in this kind of case. So it goes to the government. It's essentially like a tax. You could think of it.
Well, on a larger note, would you not agree? I'm not taking sides, but rarely do I not speak out when I believe something. I mean, we've seen so many cyber standards, so many new cyber regulations get put out at a sector level, and then nothing happens. In this particular case, within 12 months, you've got some real material differences that you see. You got some companies that are paying some big fines. Do we not see that this is a net win for the SEC's intent for in general? I mean, it's not, to me, I think it's good that at least they're following through. I wouldn't want to be one of those companies, and I'm sure it'll get litigated outside of this initial finding, but it's good to see that they're delivering what they said they do, whether there's detail there. I mean, how does the industry look at these things? How do they feel?
Well, it's certainly, I said it back in August at Black Hat when well in advance of this, I said the SEC is going to be coming with cases to put some oomph behind this regulation, to put some fear in the hearts of companies in terms of corporate governance needs to change. They're really pushing this agenda, and what we've seen, and just in that October 22nd announcement, indeed they are bringing cases and they're going to continue doing it. And it's the same sort of regulation by enforcement that we saw with the Tim Brown case, which I know we'll talk about in a second.
Let's dive into that.
But yeah, that's kind of, yes, it's true. They are following through. Whether it's the right thing or not, Ted, I question, because these are victim companies. The SolarWinds attack was incredibly complex. And I think, going after the people that are standing on the front lines fighting the cyber attackers is really a difficult way to see how this is going to improve the industry.
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely a multifaceted perspective.
It is.
I think in the near term, people will take it seriously, though, and I think that's the real question of how serious they'll take it. Let's take a look at a case study. You want to tell us a little bit about SEC versus Brown?
Sure thing. Yeah, and I'm sure many of those in your audience will already be very familiar with it. But it's this SEC enforcement action came out of the SolarWinds attack. The Nobelium attack really is what it was. One of the most complex and well-resourced threat attackers ever. State-sponsored attacker was hanging out undetected in the systems of thousands of companies by virtue of a patch that was unwittingly sent out by SolarWinds containing a backdoor. And it only, it took down quite a few government agencies, thousands of companies, because of course it's a supply chain attack. And so the SEC reacted to this by bringing us an enforcement action against not only the company SolarWinds, but also its CISO Tim Brown for allegedly having failed to disclose the weaknesses in the cyber program there, and for having overstated the strengths of it, bringing in all kinds of disclosures that are not usually in scope for an SEC case. Things like blog posts that he'd written and podcasts that he'd been guest on, talking about his thoughts for the ideal situation that you'd want to have for cybersecurity. And they brought intentional securities fraud charges against him, which are very severe, very serious. It's a quasi-criminal charge that, if he settles to, is going to have really significant impacts on his career, reputation, and ability to work in the future. So it was a really big shot across the bow. The court the federal court trimmed many of the allegations back in July, but they allowed the intentional securities fraud charge against Brown to continue. So that was the first time a federal court has ever blessed that sort of charge being brought against anybody in InfoSec for failure to disclose and for allegedly misleading about the security posture of a company. So it's very significant, and it's still ongoing. Hopefully, I heard something about a settlement. The talks are underway, but remains to be seen how this will all sort out.
Is everything public when someone starts a case like that, or is it only become public when they start to end the case? How does that work, just from a kind of tactical perspective?
Sure, there will be discussions before anything is filed, and the SEC, as we saw on the October 22nd settlements around the cyber disclosure rules, sometimes in that case, a settlement will be the first thing that becomes public. But if a company and an individual does not settle, then what you'll see is a complaint being filed in federal court laying out all the allegations. And that's what happened in the Brown case, where we get this whole, very long complaint. In fact, they amended it at one point. I think it was over 220 pages of in-depth allegations about every single thing that they claim was done or not done.
Interesting. I wonder how many more of these are going to be right behind this. They're sort of setting a precedent, if you will, right now, I'm assuming. And I'm assuming everybody is a little bit different, right?
Yeah, they are. I think that we will continue to see more. This is following pretty hard on the heels of the July order and the Brown case, the order trimming the allegations. What we see in the October settlements is essentially the SEC trying again with very similar allegations that the federal court rejected, but nonetheless companies in a settlement posture have a different calculus on trying to resolve the case and put it behind them. So I think we're going to continue to see pretty aggressive enforcement in this area, that, you know, things that we may not have been able to predict about what is going to be required until such time as, you know, we're being examined in hindsight by one of the biggest regulators in the country.
Well, and I'm curious. So let's just talk for a second about, based on all the things that you've seen happen up to this point on SEC. Two questions, and you can answer in any direction. But I'm curious: is it just the SEC, or are we dealing with a lot of civil cases from shareholders at all, right? And then secondarily, who's really getting pointed at as the person that's either getting sued or the case being brought? Is it always the CISO, or is it a staff, or is it the company? Just your perspective on those two.
Sure thing. Yes. So I think we are seeing it directed towards CISOs, because they're in the role of being the in the know about the cybersecurity issues, any attacks, any risks that they're seeing, and sort of they are the communicator back to the rest of the corporate governance structure. So they're sort of have that key perspective. That being said, I have defended many others in InfoSec in that sort of pre-public time before the settlement or the charge is being brought. And that can include lawyers in the information security, section, or chief information officers or chief technology officers. There's always some, the CTO, the CIO, everybody can get dragged in, and then they essentially will look to who is most likely, who's closest to the blast zone. I almost think of it as like the metaphor being, an atomic explosion. Who's glowing, and who's radioactive, and the one that's glowing the most will be the one that gets named in the ultimate case. And yes, the SEC is very, very active in the space, very aggressive. Obviously, we see that. But there are many other regulators as well standing in the wings. If there's a negative consumer implication or harm to the market, we could see, CFTC, FTC, the DOJ. The thing with intentional securities fraud being a quasi-criminal charge is that there are often parallel investigations where, if they can make it stick civilly, they may be able to make it stick criminally as well. And that certainly has been something the government has tried to do in cases I've defended before.
Well, in my research, what I think was done, and I think there was some news about this specifically to the SolarWinds SEC case, but tying cybersecurity controls to internal accounting controls, that one would be more of an egregious effect from a criminal perspective. But correct me if I'm wrong, the courts decided that those are two separate things, yes?
They did. In the July order, you're very right. They separated those things out. But they still, the core issue is around whether or not there was a whitewash, whether it's on the financial disclosures side or the cyber disclosures side. Is there something that we're hiding from the shareholders in order to keep the stock price high? And if so, then that can be securities fraud, regardless of whether it's about the cyber disclosures or the financial disclosures.
So just in layman's terms, if you're going to have securities fraud, I know it's probably much bigger than this, but you are withholding, or you are whitewashing, you are covering up information that would not tell the whole truth to your constituents or to your investors, right? And
that's right.
What people are trying to do is they're trying to say, well, cybersecurity can become so pervasive as a challenge. It's going to affect us financially. Why would cyber controls not be linked to our overall financial outcomes? That's really what's at stake here.
That's right. That's why with that new 2023 cybersecurity rule around the 4 days to disclose any material incidents, materiality. The concept of materiality is around whether or not it would cause a shareholder to buy, sell, or hold. So it does relate to that ultimate value question.
I think one of the themes, and I'm going to pull up our next slide here just so you can kind of position, because we're talking about other cases, right? But the theme that I live within is how many dollars, how many people, and how much time are you going to allocate towards your overall cyber mission, right? If you're looking at a chemical company that's doing really well financially and a chemical company that on paper looks the same but may not have as great of a year, it's a real question. How many resources am I going to deploy to that? And it always comes back to, what is the business outcome I'm either trying to achieve or avoid? So I think, as much as I've heard some organizations say, well, either we're not publicly owned or we're not really a bank and we're really not managed by any sort of like legal boundaries for our sector. This is actually a big case, because if someone said you did not fix that cyber control and you had non-productive time, or the quality of your product that you manufacture was down, if they can tie a link between those business outcomes and whether someone would buy, sell, or hold on the stock, then that's linking it to some sort of financial outcome. Am I making sense?
It does make sense. And I think even private companies will need to be concerned about that from the perspective of DOJ enforcement, because while the SEC enforces against only issuers, that's not the case for the DOJ. So if there were an especially egregious case where they could make a case showing that there was an intentional cover-up or misleading statements, affirmatively misleading statements to try to prop up a stock price, that could create a criminal enforcement action.
Interesting. And is this along the lines of our next slide here? What are some other lessons that we're finding in this space?
Sure. I think your point about investment is a good one. Companies obviously need to pay a lot of attention to their cyber security posture and try their best. But we can see the lessons from the SolarWinds, from the Nobelium attack, are that sometimes there's nothing you can do, because your attacker, your adversary, is so well resourced and so sophisticated that even some of the most amazing cybersecurity companies in the world were victims of that attack. And so in that case, you're going to have an atomic bomb situation, and you're going to have government coming after you, trying to find, in hindsight, who screwed up, who did not communicate, who was responsible for whatever failures they will attribute to that situation. And so that's what would lead to kind of the, what can we do about this question?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's really interesting. Well, let me ask you. So if you're going to manage your risk, and you're sitting there as either a CISO, OT director, IT director, this is my biggest question, is how do you manage that risk that either somebody's going to come from DOJ or SEC? How would you guide your clients?
Sure, absolutely. It is a push and pull. And one of the things I think you've seen and I've seen too is that, the most well-meaning CISOs and information security personnel, they may want to get all kinds of investment in different tools and ways to harden the attack surface and all the rest of that. And they may not be able to get that, because maybe the budget doesn't support it, or the executive level doesn't support it, or the board doesn't support it. And so one of the things that I've counseled clients and potential clients is that, when you're making those asks, you need to be reasonable about it, and you need to be careful about how you communicate about it, because everything you put in writing can eventually be evidence in some kind of government investigation. So, don't be too emphatic in demanding particular investments that may not come to fruition because of whatever reason. But by the same token, if you're continuing to get, deaf ears and no investment and no support, then you also need to be considering the implications of that for you. And if you're in a losing situation and you're kind of headed towards a blast radius that you may be in, then you may need to really think about how to protect yourself. And that's a really tough spot to be in. I think most CISOs probably have to face some of that, no matter what.
Absolutely. Well, I will give you a real world example of two different scenarios that I've seen firsthand. I'm working with senior leaders of an organization, And one of them says, I don't want to do any cyber assessments of any of my facilities because the second that I get all those results back it's all on my shoulders that I have to deliver some sort of control, closure, some sort of risk mitigation. I just don't want that liability. And my answer to them is, you already have the liability. Why would you not want to know where you need to put your efforts? The other side of the coin is that I've dealt with some leadership that say, look, I need to do cyber assessments across as many of these facilities as I can. I need to go and communicate effectively why we need controls in place. And I think the latter is always the one that I would help people do or recommend, because you're able to go to your leadership and say, look, we've evaluated things, here are the gaps. And if you don't get the resources for it, is that not a situation where the CISO can absolve him or herself from that responsibility when they tried to go and request for those resources? Or do you think that people actually do have a little bit of an ostrich syndrome where, if I don't assess anything and I don't know anything, how is that a defensible position? What say you?
Yeah, I think it's a balance. You know, it's difficult to say one way or the other exactly what people should do because it's situation dependent. Certainly, assessments are a useful way to figure out how we can improve the cybersecurity posture. But I've also sat with CISOs in federal court in depositions and plaintiff lawsuits where they pulled out the report and said, you had 100 0 days and what did you do about this? And the CISO's in the really difficult position of saying, well, the company wouldn't resource it. So it is a really challenging position to be in about whether, to be an ostrich or not. But those are the kinds of things that could come back to haunt you. So again, if you do the assessment and you come up with those 100 0 days and the company won't give you the resources to address it, and you continue to have this intractable problem, then it may not be the right company for you to be working for. If that's because the risk can be personal to you, whether it's from a civil lawsuit or otherwise.
It's like I tell people all the time. I mean, how you assess the posture of your company, how you manage that data, it all comes back to teamwork. It all comes back to communication. It all comes back to resource allocation. I think it would be a very hard sell for anybody, whether SEC or DOJ, to look at a CISO who used the resources allocated effectively, done some comparative analysis, and said, this person worked with what they had. Definitely story dependent. Let me ask you this. How much do you think benchmarking by industry is today going to play a role versus the future? And what I mean by that is, if someone is in a chemical company and says, well, I didn't get the resources that I asked for, or in the flip side, say, hey, man, we had so many resources, does the SEC or DOJ have any access to any data, or are they starting to think about what commonplace budget allocation should be for a given sector?
That is, I think, going to be a downstream implication from the new disclosure rules, because we're seeing disclosures, right, which we did not have before. And so there will be a point in time, and I think, certainly there are people already studying this by industry and by sector and by, all the different metrics to see like what the disclosures look like, so that when my firm is counseling clients and companies on what disclosures to make, we're looking at that. We're trying to sort of be, they like to say, not the zebra in the front of the pack and not the zebra trailing in the back of the pack, but someone right in the middle. And so I think as we see these kinds of disclosures evolve, we'll start to get a sense from benchmarking about, what different companies are doing, because they're having now to tell everyone publicly what they're doing, which is new.
I think so I hear this happen all the time is, hey, how do we compare to our peers? Benchmarking is tough because what are you going to benchmark on? You're going to benchmark on a cyber standard, a cyber framework, a compliance. Is it based on capital allocated to one facility, or is it a corporate? And that's, you bring an IT and OT together. I think that we're a decade away from that. But, if you had to point to one thing, this is totally unscripted, but if you had to point to one thing that the SEC would do to add teeth to its current regulation in 12 months, based on the learnings of the next 20 filings, where do you think they're headed?
Well, I think that they have continually said, and I've heard this in numerous investigations that I've defended and negotiations, that individuals, they need heads to roll in order to get the point across. That's their view. That's their enforcement posture. And so the one that the settlement we saw on October 22nd was no individuals were named. So that was a shot across the bow, and that's interesting. But that's interesting to the legal team, the SEC disclosure team, to the board. How do we fix our corporate governance? But it's not of interest to the same visceral degree as bringing a federal securities fraud charge against a CISO, or, God forbid, a DOJ criminal securities fraud case. That's the kind of thing that the government thinks will get people to really sit up and take notice. And I think we saw that with the Brown case and with some of these other investigations. It's harder and harder to ignore it when it could be your head on the chopping block.
Well, and we had somebody on the show, I guess about 3 or 4 months ago, and we talked about how does the compensation structure and the incentive structures work for security leaders. And we went through all types of data models. And one question that I asked her was, do we see an uptick in senior executive pay and compensation that is commensurate with the amount of liability that they're taking on? And the answer, to my recollection, was no. It just doesn't seem like it's going on. Now, what say you on the perspective of a CISO role and the risks around it over the course of the next 12 months, based on what we're seeing?
I think we should see a very strong uptick in the pay, the compensation, the protection, the indemnity, and the voice and role of CISOs, because there's really no other choice. And there's such a scarcity right now. So the market power is with the CISOs. And if we can get everyone together to use that and say, look, if you want really top notch, skill in this role, expertise in this role, and you want somebody whose head could be on the chopping block to do everything we can, and we need to make sure that we're protected. And so that can include reporting directly to the C-suite, being an actual officer, not just CISO. The O is obviously stands for officer, but in many companies they're not actually an officer, so they're not necessarily protected by the D&O insurance. So I think we need to see a sea change in this, and I think we will. I don't know how fast it'll happen, because obviously executive pay is another budget item amongst many competing budget items. But I think we are getting there, because this is something where we can't afford to keep doing this job for insufficient pay and insufficient protection from the company.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's always been hard for CISOs and security roles to tie their activities to return on investment. I mean, anybody will ask you, how do you do ROI in cyber? And I'm actually an opponent to that belief. I am a proponent of saying there's a non-productive time here. There's some sort of compliance mandate blanket that we could get fined up to X amount, but we're not fined. I think the more that the SEC fines these companies, the more teeth that a CISO has to come back and say, I didn't have a $1 million fine. We didn't have X amount of dollars spent on governance and lawyers to fight against this. So in some way, something that's happening that's good for CISOs is they can start saying, well, look, I didn't have that experience here. I protected you. And I think there should be some element of compensation for that. We'll only have to see over time if that actually plays through.
You're right. It's very difficult, because what you're talking about is the value of prevention. It's like, yes, I went to the doctor and I did all the things that I was told to do in my checkup, and I didn't get cancer. It's so difficult to track that. But I think industry-wide, we are seeing more and more data emerging about the cost of incidents and the cost of disclosure issues is something that can be taken into account. But it's ephemeral. It's more difficult to express that to the board or to the C-suite in terms of encouraging investment. It is hard, but I think if we can, get those tools in the hands of the right people, they can use that to try to, like you said, to make clear the value of various investments.
Well, you had two other points. One was safety net, and then one is navigating crisis, right? Any comments on those in particular that maybe we haven't covered?
Sure, yes. So the safety net is when you walk into that role, as you get more senior in the organization, if you're going for that eventual CISO title, what do you need to have from the company to protect you? And as you get more responsibility, you should have more protection. So ideally, what the board members get and the CEOs and CTOs and CIOs usually get is an indemnification agreement, which basically says that if you ever have to defend yourself in an investigation or against a civil lawsuit, that we got your back. We'll give you money to pay for your own lawyer. You can choose your lawyer. I really like that clause in there. And basically to know that no matter what happens, you're protected. And the D&O insurance is an important part of that as well. The directors and officers insurance coverage. Again, you need to be an officer or a director to be covered. So what is your title? Is it approved by the board? And what is the coverage? And is it adequate? And will it be there for you when you need it? So those are the kind of safety net things that I usually suggest that people think about. And it can be hard. It depends on your leverage of what you're able to negotiate, but it certainly should be on the table for any employment negotiation. And I've got a whole roster of employment lawyers that I refer CISOs out to because I speak to many of them that are in this quandary, call me up and say, oh my gosh, this is happening and I've tried to tell them to change it, but they won't change it. And I don't have indemnity. I don't have D&O. What should I do? Those are conversations I have on a weekly basis. And it's not easy. It's never easy, but sometimes you do have to lawyer up and sometimes you need somebody to guide you through just an onboarding process to make sure that you get, the protection that you're entitled to or should have.
I talked to so many folks that are either CISOs and their company didn't understand how they needed support, or they're enrolling in CISO jobs, and the CISO job for company A and the CISO job for company B are so different. The demands are so different. It's tough out there. I agree with your perspective. I mean, you've got to protect yourself and be in a position to defend yourself. It's great advice. It's really great advice.
You really do. And so, yeah, for that crisis, like that moment when the walls start to glow and this is a really bad incident and I'm right in the middle of it, that it's really important to think about how you're communicating during that time. Because you can imagine if it's a really big blast that there is going to be some fly specking of what every single thing you do. And this is the kind of time when, as you know, Ted, like people are not sleeping. It's multiple days of just in the trenches, warfare. You're focused on just trying to get
almost too late. It's almost too late. It's like if you're not covered with your own kind of incident or disaster recovery or incident response CISO protection plan, you're probably behind the 8 ball. Then you're a little late, huh?
You probably are, but even I think my communication advice goes throughout all of this, right? Before, during, and after. You do need to think about what words you're using and who you're communicating with and how you're communicating. Because I've defended really complex cases where folks went to ephemeral messages because they couldn't use the platform because it was compromised. And so when I come around to try to help them defend what they did, I don't have the key communications, and that can be a real problem. And then I've also seen people use really inflammatory language, trying to make action happen, and that's really problematic too. So, I usually advise the New York Times test. If you wouldn't want to see it on the front page of the paper, rephrase it, don't write it. But that written history is going to be what will make or break your role. And so you really need to focus on that and be aware of that, follow whatever's in the IRP about how you should communicate. And then how you communicate is really vitally important.
Makes sense. Well, this has been super insightful. The CISO role is already overworked, probably underpaid, and it varies company to company. And now they got all this new pressure on them. We talked about regulatory landscape. We talked about some of the different things that are happening to CISOs right now. Talked a lot about how do you position yourself to be protected? What do you do right in the throes of battle, if you will? as we narrow to a close here, where do you think the CISO role is going to evolve? What's the future look like?
Well, I hope that the future looks like the CISO actually being in the C-suite, that C and that O will become real. Chief Information Security Officer. I want to see them at the table, having a seat at the table, being able to communicate with the board regularly and to have all kinds of channels to communicate issues up the chain to try to make change happen. And then if change won't happen, I want to see people voting with their feet, because the only way we can make change happen industry wide is if we all are focused on these issues and we hold companies to this. We can't let them continue the way that it's been going, because right now there's a real shortage of people who are willing to do this role. And I'd like to see a really robust group of people standing between me and all the other people in the world against threat actors. That's what we need. That's what we really want.
Well, I sure do appreciate you coming on to the show. Thank you so much for what you do for the industry. Thanks for looking out for all those security leaders. They definitely got a lot on their shoulders. That's the Business of Cyber show. Thank you for watching today. Once again, there's not enough great CISOs out there. There's not enough time and there's not enough budget. And it takes collaboration with folks like Jess to make sure that we're covering our bases, protecting our industries, and more than anything, we're being honest about what kind of role we have out there and the resources we need to do it well. Jess, thanks for what you do for the industry. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks so much, Ted, for having me on. It was a really, really fun time. Thank you.
Cool deal. Let's see.